Hello and welcome. Today's true story is titled, She Survived the Blitz, but her toughest battle began in small-town America. Before we begin today's true story, a foreword. The story of the American GI bride is often remembered as a fairy tale ending to the Second World War. A whirlwind romance born amidst the chaos, a hopeful voyage across the ocean to a land of plenty, and the promise of a new life. Nearly 70,000 British women made that journey, each one the heroine of her own love story. But what happened after the ship docked and the newspapers turned their cameras away? What battle began when the war everyone knew was over? For many, the hardest fight wasn't waged in the rubble of Europe, but in the quiet kitchens and lonely living rooms of small-town America. The enemy wasn't an army, but a silence more deafening than the bombs they had survived. The following is the story of one of those women. She survived the Blitz, but her toughest battle began not with a bang, but with a quiet, creeping dread, in a place she was supposed to call home. Chapter 1. The Thesis of the Heart. November 14th, 1940, Coventry, England. The air in the public shelter is thick with the taste of coal dust, damp wool, and fear. It is a cramped, fetid space, dug into the cold earth, where the shallow breaths of strangers merge into a single collective prayer against the noise. For 19-year-old Margaret Joyce, the noise is everything. It isn't a sound that is merely heard. It is felt in the bones, a physical presence that vibrates up through the soles of her shoes. It is a terrifying, rhythmic drone that seems to come from the very center of the world, the synchronized engines of hundreds of Heinkel He 111 bombers. They are methodically executing the plan known as Operation Mondscheinsonate, the Moonlight Sonata. The ground shudders, not like a train passing, but in a deep, sickening lurch, the vibration of a city of stone and brick being systematically torn apart. With each successive explosion, a fine powder of pulverized mortar and ancient dust rains down from the wooden beams overhead, catching in the throat and stinging the eyes. A baby begins to cry, a thin, helpless wail that is instantly swallowed by the apocalyptic roar from above. Margaret huddles in the dark, knees drawn to her chest, her world reduced to this suffocating box. She thinks of her mother, just a few streets away, and wonders if her shelter is any stronger than this one. She believes, with every fiber of her being, that this must be the worst the war can offer, the absolute limit of human terror. She survives the night. As a gray, smoke-choked dawn breaks, she emerges into a landscape of ash and ruin, a city center erased from the map, its cathedral a hollowed-out shell, its spire a skeletal finger pointing to a silent sky. She has endured, and in the exhausted, hollow relief of survival, she believes the battle is over. She is wrong. The physical destruction of Coventry was a measurable event, recorded in the cold arithmetic of bomb tonnages and casualty figures. German records would later confirm that 449 bombers dropped 503 tons of high explosives and nearly 900 incendiary canisters, killing 568 people and destroying over 4,300 homes. But what followed for Margaret, and for tens of thousands of women like her, was a battle for which there were no official ledgers, no casualty lists. This was a crisis measured not in the logistics of war, but in the quiet, devastating calculus of the human heart. Her journey across the Atlantic, ostensibly toward safety and prosperity, would trigger one of the largest and most overlooked social and psychological migrations of the post-war era. The complex logistics of love and heartbreak were about to be written, not by generals and command centers, but by ordinary women thrust into extraordinary circumstances, armed with little more than a suitcase and a photograph of a man they barely knew. Chapter 2. An American in an English town. By 1943, life for Margaret had settled into the managed deprivation of wartime Britain. Her world was a rotation of blackout curtains that turned every evening into a premature midnight, the incessant gnawing worry for loved ones serving overseas, and the small, persistent indignities of rationing. Existence was defined by what you went without, a daily lesson in the art of making something from almost nothing. The weekly cheese ration, a block the size of a matchbox, had to be graded to give the illusion of volume. The utility clothing, stamped with the drab, government-approved CC-41 logo, was a constant reminder that even personal expression was a servant of the state. The landscape itself seemed to conspire in the gloom, a pervasive damp and gray that seeped into the bones of an island under siege. Into this monochrome world walked Sergeant Frank Miller, an engineer from Ohio with the 8th Air Force. They did not meet in a dramatic, cinematic moment of fate, but in the functional, well-lit commonality of an American Red Cross club dance, a place of determined cheerfulness against a backdrop of war. The juxtaposition of their two worlds was immediate and stark. The GIs were a splash of impossible color. They seemed to move with a different energy, a loose-limbed confidence unburdened by years of siege. They had things that felt like artifacts from a forgotten civilization. Nylon stockings, Hershey's chocolate bars, Lucky Strike cigarettes handed out with a casual generosity that was simply astonishing to a people who saved their foil wrappers. Their uniforms were sharp and well-made, their accents exotic and full of vowels that seemed to stretch for miles. And beneath it all, they carried an aura of seemingly boundless optimism, a deep-seated belief in a future that was not just about survival, but about ambition and growth. As one British woman would later recall, they were so tall and confident. They hadn't been bombed and they hadn't been starved. They were like men from another planet. This was not merely a meeting between a man and a woman. It was a collision of two cultures. For Margaret, Frank Miller wasn't just a charming sergeant with an easy smile and a pocket full of chewing gum. He was the physical embodiment of a place called America, a land untouched by bombs, a living, breathing promise of a different kind of life. Chapter 3. The statistics of a promise. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of war, a relationship accelerated by the constant, unspoken awareness of mortality. In a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, decisions of the heart were made with a desperate urgency. There was no time for the slow, cautious courtships of the pre-war era. A shared dance, a few stolen walks, a handful of letters, these had to be enough to build a future on. This was the unique emotional landscape that fostered nearly 70,000 transatlantic marriages, a phenomenon born of proximity and peril. Their story was written in the thin, blue airmail letters that took weeks to cross the ocean, each one a precious artifact. Frank's letters were filled with the architecture of a dream. He described life in Ohio not as a poet, but as an engineer, with a focus on glorious, solid facts that sounded like a fantasy to a girl who measured her life in ration coupons. He wrote of a detached house with a green yard, not a terraced house with a concrete yard. He described owning a car, a Ford V8, and the freedom of driving for miles just for the pleasure of it. He detailed the contents of a magical box called a refrigerator, always full of milk, butter, and meat. Her letters in turn revealed the deep, universal yearning of her generation. A desire not for luxury, but for normalcy, for security that had been stolen from them by years of war. It was here that the mathematics of the heart came into play. For a GI like Frank, a British wife was often seen as a symbol of what they were fighting for. Steady, charming, a link to an old-world culture they found both quaint and comforting. For a woman like Margaret, an American husband was a ticket out of the rubble, a way to bypass the grim, arduous years of post-war reconstruction that everyone knew were coming. The proposal, when it came, felt less like a question and more like a logical conclusion. Their love was genuine, a real and powerful connection forged in a time of crisis. But it was also underwritten by a powerful unspoken contract, a treaty of hope based on the promise of a better world. As they, and thousands of others, would soon discover, a promise is not a plan. And hope is not a currency that can be spent at the local grocery store in small-town America. Chapter 4. The bureaucracy of a new life. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The street parties and celebrations were a cathartic, delirious release, a moment of pure collective joy as neighbors danced in the streets and effigies of Hitler burned on towering bonfires. But for Margaret, the end of one war simply marked the beginning of another, a quiet, frustrating, and deeply personal battle against paperwork. Frank was shipped home with his unit, his departure swift and clinical, part of a vast military machine that had no room for sentiment. He was gone, leaving her in a state of administrative limbo. This was the start of an immense, impersonal, and deeply frustrating logistical operation to transport tens of thousands of foreign brides and their children to the United States. The War Brides Act of 1945 was the legislative key, a document that sounded simple and compassionate, but was, in practice, a labyrinth of bureaucracy. Margaret's experience became universal. She joined the endless queues outside the American consulate in London, her personal love story reduced to a thick file of forms, visa applications, shipping manifests, medical histories. There were intrusive physical examinations, probing interviews with stoic consular officials who asked blunt questions about her character and motives, and exhaustive background checks by military intelligence. Her entire life was scrutinized, weighed, and measured. The evidence of this period is found not only in memoirs, but in the dry, interofficial language of government documents. Form 255, Affidavit of Support, a Form 575, Application for Non-Quota Immigration Visa. The contrast with the emotional letters she still received from Frank was jarring. His passionate prose was now filled with practical anxieties about her arrival, about which documents she needed, which sailing dates were available. The process was profoundly dehumanizing. These women, who had made a deeply personal and emotional choice to marry a man from another country, were now reduced to case numbers, their futures contingent on the thud of a rubber stamp. It was the first stark lesson that her life was no longer entirely her own. Her journey was now subject to the cold, unforgiving logistics of international migration, and the vibrant, urgent romance of their courtship was giving way to the gray, procedural reality of state-sanctioned relocation. Chapter 5. The Bride's Ships. At last, after months of agonizing waiting, the summons came. A telegram with cold block letter instructions. Her passage was booked on one of the bride's ships, a repurposed troop transport like the SS Argentina or the Queen Mary, its decks now crowded not with soldiers heading to war, but with women and children sailing toward a new peace. This chapter of her life unfolded in the unique transitory world of that vessel. The atmosphere on board was a complex, volatile mixture of giddy excitement, profound sadness, and a deep, humming apprehension. The ship itself was a strange hybrid, its military past showing through. The cabins were cramped, the paint was institutional gray, and the faint smell of engine oil and disinfectant hung in the air. For the first time, Margaret was surrounded by hundreds of women whose stories mirrored her own. They were a demographic anomaly, a floating community of new wives and mothers, suspended between the old world they had left behind and the new one they were sailing toward. Testimonies from women who made the crossing described the endless circulating conversations in the communal areas. They shared worn photographs of their husbands, men they hadn't seen in months, sometimes years, pictures of hometowns in places like Iowa, Texas, and Ohio. These were places they could not truly imagine, names on a map that held the entire weight of their future. The American Red Cross ran classes on board, attempting to teach them how to be American housewives. The lessons formed a surreal curriculum of cultural conversion, covering everything from the mysteries of baking with unfamiliar measurements, like cups, to deciphering the intricacies of the U.S. monetary system. They were given pamphlets with earnest advice on how to understand American slang and how to prepare popular American dishes like meatloaf. The journey itself became a powerful metaphor. As the gray, familiar shores of England receded into the mist, so too did a part of their identity. They were no longer simply English, but they were not yet American. They existed in a liminal state, their entire lives packed into a single suitcase. Their futures built on a foundation of letters and promises, sailing across a vast and indifferent ocean. Chapter 6. A Foreign Land. A Foreign Love. The arrival in New York City was a sensory and emotional assault. The iconic, welcoming image of the Statue of Liberty, glimpsed through the sea haze, was a moment of genuine, breathtaking awe for the women crowded on the deck. But this cinematic ideal was immediately contrasted with the chaotic, impersonal reality of the processing center on a Hudson River pier. The scale and energy of America were overwhelming. The noise was a physical force, a constant barrage of car horns, shouting voices, and the rumble of a city that never seemed to rest. The buildings were impossibly tall, canyons of steel and glass that blocked out the sky. Contemporary newspapers and magazines covered the arrivals of the bride's ships with a curious fascination, treating it as a public spectacle, a human interest story of foreign newcomers arriving to claim their American husbands. The reunion with Frank was the emotional climax of the journey, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy and relief that was also unsettlingly tinged with strangeness. For a few perfect seconds, he was the man from her photographs. Then the differences began to register. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a suit and tie, his familiar, reassuring uniform gone. His American accent, once a charming novelty in England, was now part of the general cacophony, no longer distinct. He was back in his element, confident and assured on his home soil, navigating the crowds with an easy familiarity. She was completely out of hers, clinging to his arm like a child. It is a subtle but powerful shift that psychologists of reintegration understand well. The relationship born in the crucible of war must be renegotiated in the mundane environment of peace. The first seeds of doubt were sown not in an argument, but in that moment of quiet observation. As Frank guided her through the impossibly crowded, noisy streets of New York, Margaret felt a profound sense of dislocation. She had not just crossed an ocean, she had landed on another planet. And the man holding her hand, the man who had been her anchor in a world at war, now felt in some small but terrifying way like a stranger from that alien world. Chapter 7. Welcome to Providence, Ohio. The train journey from the East Coast to the Midwest was itself an education. It was a journey from the idea of America to its sprawling continental reality. The cinematic myth of New York's skylines gave way hour by hour to a landscape that seemed impossibly vast and empty to English eyes. For Margaret, perched by the window, the endless fields of corn, the colossal barns, and the sheer distance between towns was a quiet revelation. This was a country defined by space. Finally, they arrived in the fictional town of Providence, a composite of thousands of similar towns across the nation in the late 1940s. It was a place of grid-like streets, of timber-frame houses with open porches and unfenced yards that seemed to bleed into one another in a way that felt both communal and strangely exposed. It was a place of conspicuous silence in the afternoons, a quiet broken only by the mournful sound of a distant train or the drone of a lone cicada. This was the world Frank called home, a world of comforting familiarity to him and one of stifling foreignness to her. The contrast with Coventry was absolute. Her home was a place of ancient, winding streets, of brick and stone, of pubs and corner shops and shared public spaces, born of centuries of necessity. Providence was a place of wood and space, of private lives, lived behind identical screen doors. Her first letters home were filled with observations that betrayed her confusion and isolation. She described the bewildering abundance of the local grocery store, a palace of plenty with aisles of canned goods and a butcher's counter piled high with meat, a sight that filled her not with joy, but with a strange, paralyzing anxiety. She wrote about the bizarre social rituals of the church potluck, where casseroles made with cream of mushroom soup were a staple, and the overwhelming, unbroken flatness of the landscape. It was, without question, a land of plenty. But as she sat on the porch of their small rented house in the evenings, listening to the crickets in the profound twilight stillness, it felt emotionally barren. The promise of a new life was beginning to look and feel unsettlingly like a life sentence. Chapter 8. The Calculus of Belonging. The physical environment was alien, but the social one proved to be the greater, more complex challenge. This was the beginning of her lesson in the immense unspoken challenge of assimilation. In Providence, Margaret's arrival was a local curiosity. She wasn't Margaret Joyce. She was Frank's English wife. Her first interactions with Frank's family and the wider community were a series of gentle but firm corrections, lessons in a cultural grammar she didn't know she was violating. Her otherness was a constant, unspoken subject. Her accent, once considered charming by Frank, was now a novelty that quickly became a barrier, something to be commented upon, sometimes even mimicked in jest. Her English manners, her tendency to say sorry too often, her more reserved demeanor, were perceived as either quaint or, worse, aloof. Her attempts to cook familiar dishes from home, a small effort to reclaim a piece of her identity in the kitchen, were met with polite but firm rejection in favor of local fare. A steak and kidney pie was an object of suspicion. A pot roast was an object of comfort. Sociological texts on post-war American conformity, alongside contemporary articles from local newspapers, reveal a society that discussed the GI bride question with a mixture of paternalism and suspicion. The narrative of her life was being written by others. To some, she was an exotic prize Frank had won overseas. To others, particularly the mothers of local single women, she was a foreign interloper who had taken a husband that belonged to one of their own. This was the calculus of belonging, and it was a brutal equation. To be accepted, it seemed she must erase every trace of her Englishness, her accent, her tastes, her perspective on politics and the world. Belonging was not a welcome mat. It was a test. And it was a test, administered daily in 100 tiny interactions, that she felt she was constantly, quietly failing. Chapter 9. The Logistics of Loneliness. Frank returned to his pre-war job at the local factory, slipping back into a life that had been waiting for him. For Margaret, this departure each morning signaled the start of her new reality, and the crushing logistics of loneliness became the defining feature of her existence. Her days fell into a routine that was both bewildering and achingly monotonous. The mornings were a battle with unfamiliar American domestic technology, the temperamental washing machine in the basement that shuddered across the concrete floor, the gas-powered stove that hissed alarmingly, the heavy, roaring vacuum cleaner that felt like wrestling a wild animal. These machines, meant to be liberating, felt like alien overlords. The afternoons were the worst. They stretched into an abyss of silence, punctuated only by the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. The social fabric of Providence was woven differently than in England. There was no popping round to the neighbors for a cup of tea. Fences may have been absent, but invisible walls stood tall between the houses. Social life revolved around deep-rooted family networks and school friendships, from which she was, by definition, completely excluded. The diaries of actual war brides from this period are filled with heartbreakingly similar accounts of profound loneliness. "The silence is the loudest thing in America," one wrote. Another confessed, "I would talk to the man who delivered the milk, just to hear another voice." One day bled into the next, an identical cycle of household chores performed in a house that did not feel like a home. The post-war American suburban dream was often, for women, a dream of isolation. For a woman like Margaret, who came from the intensely communal, collectivized experience of wartime Britain, where survival had been a shared public endeavor, this sudden solitude was not peaceful. It was a form of psychological torment. Each day, the chapter of her life always ended the same way, with Margaret standing at her living room window, watching the identical lives unfolding in the houses across the street, feeling utterly and completely invisible. Chapter 10. The Economy of a Failing Dream. The great myth of post-war America was its universal, effortless prosperity. Magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post painted a gleaming picture of a nation of happy consumers. But while the nation as a whole was booming, for a young couple starting out with little more than a veteran's salary, life was often a struggle. This was the economy of a failing dream. Frank's job was stable, but it was not lucrative, and the financial tensions began to fray the edges of their relationship. The evidence is rooted in the economic history of the period, the rising cost of living, the modest salaries for returning veterans, and the immense societal pressure to acquire and consume. Margaret, a graduate of the Make Do and Mend School of Wartime Austerity, was horrified by the casual consumerism she saw. She watched neighbors buy new cars on credit and throw away items she would have painstakingly repaired. This casual waste felt like a moral failing to her. Frank, on the other hand, felt a deep-seated masculine pressure to provide his foreign wife with the American standard of living he had described in his letters. He saw credit and consumer goods not as frivolous, but as the very proof of his success. These differing perspectives led to arguments that were ostensibly about money, but were really about their clashing values and unfulfilled expectations. The beautiful house from his letters was a modest rental with peeling paint. The shiny new car was a second-hand Ford that broke down frequently. A tense recurring scene played out in their small kitchen. Margaret carefully planning meals to stretch every dollar while Frank flipped through a catalog, dreaming of a new radio or a better sofa. The central conflict was this. The dream Frank had sold her was based on the collective myth of America, but the life they were living was based on the specific, limited reality of their own bank account. The emotional distance between them grew, a silence fueled by his resentment at her perceived lack of gratitude, and her disappointment in a promise that felt increasingly hollow. Chapter 11. The Unspoken War. The cumulative weight of homesickness, isolation, and marital tension led, inevitably, to a crisis. This was the unspoken war, a battle fought entirely within the confines of her own mind. Margaret descended into what would today be diagnosed as severe depression, but in the 1940s there was no language for her condition. There was no framework for understanding her suffering. To the community, and even to her husband, she was simply seen as difficult, ungrateful, or melancholy. Her symptoms were stark and debilitating. Sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every perceived slight. A complete loss of appetite that saw her push food around her plate. And sudden, uncontrollable crying spells that would come upon her without warning, often in response to something as trivial as a song on the radio or the sight of a letter in the mailbox. Frank, a product of a culture that valued stoicism and saw emotional struggle as a sign of personal weakness, was at a complete loss. He tried to solve the problem with material offerings, a new dress, a trip to the cinema, gestures of love that only made her feel more profoundly misunderstood. He couldn't see that the problem wasn't a lack of things, but a lack of connection. His in-laws, well-meaning but uncomprehending, whispered among themselves, "She's just not trying," his mother-in-law would say. "She needs to buck up. The English girl is not strong enough for American life." This was the emotional nadir of her story. Margaret was fighting a war with no visible enemy and no clear objective. The very safety and quiet of her new life, the things she had yearned for in the Coventry shelter, had become her prison. And in the dead of night, the profound, unyielding silence of the Ohio suburbs felt more deafening, more terrifying than the sound of the bombs had ever been. Chapter 12. Letters from a Forgotten Home. Her only lifeline was the mail. The arrival of a thin, blue airmail letter from England, its paper almost translucent from its journey, was the focal point of her week, a fragile connection to a life that felt a world away. Her correspondence with her family became a painful study in juxtaposition. The narrator's voice could read from two sets of letters, painting two starkly different realities. First, we would hear Margaret's mother, her voice full of the news of home. She described the slow, arduous process of rebuilding Coventry, the lingering rationing, and the persistent hardships. But her letters were also filled with the familiar, comforting details of community life, a street party to celebrate a wedding, the birth of a neighbor's child, the endless gossip from the local pub. It was a portrait of a hard life, but a shared one, a life of interwoven dependencies and mutual support. In return, the audience would hear the carefully edited version of life in America that Margaret sent back. She wrote about the big car, the plentiful food, the size of the houses, and the greenness of the lawns. She described a life of material ease that was technically true, but she carefully, painfully, omitted the crushing loneliness that accompanied it all. The letters were a performance. She could not bring herself to confess the truth, feeling it would be a betrayal of the dream she had chosen, an admission of a terrible mistake that would only worry her family. The subtext of her letters was where the real story lay. Her desperate, detailed questions about trivial matters from home. Had so-and-so's daughter had her baby yet? Did the corner shop still sell her favorite biscuits? Revealed a profound aching homesickness. She was trapped between a past she could not reclaim and a future she did not want. Her only true emotional connection maintained by a fragile paper bridge thousands of miles long. Chapter 13. A small act of rebellion. The turning point, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation or a tearful breakdown. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion, a decision born of sheer desperation. After months of deepening isolation, Margaret learned, through a brief notice in a regional newspaper, of a small group of other British war brides who met once a month in a church hall in a larger city, an hour's bus ride away. She resolved to go. The act of defying Frank's bewildered objections, "Why would you want to go all that way just to talk to people you don't know?" was in itself a declaration of independence. His inability to understand was the very reason she had to go. The bus journey through the flat, unfamiliar landscape was a pilgrimage. With every mile that passed, her anxiety warred with a flicker of hope. When she finally walked into that church hall, or a basement room filled with the scent of weak tea and biscuits, the sound of a dozen English accents hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was, as she would later write in a diary, like coming home. The transformation was immediate. These women understood. They didn't need explanations. They shared tips on how to navigate American life. They complained in familiar cadences about their husbands and their in-laws, and most importantly, they laughed. They laughed at the absurdities of their shared situation, at the strange foods and stranger customs. In that laughter, Margaret found a release she hadn't realized she was so desperate for. It wasn't a magical cure. Her problems didn't disappear when she got back on the bus. But for the first time since she had stepped off the boat, she understood that she was not alone in her struggle. Her loneliness, which had felt so personal and shameful, was revealed to be a shared condition. In that small, unremarkable room, she began to forge a new hybrid identity, one that was neither exclusively English nor fully American. It was the beginning of her own personal reconstruction. Chapter 14, The Final Ledger. The story comes full circle. We are back in the Coventry shelter on that terrible November night in 1940, with a 19-year-old girl huddled in the dark, praying for survival amidst the thunder of falling bombs. The final, powerful contrast is then drawn. The battle for Coventry was a fight for physical survival against a visible, external enemy. It was a brutal, terrifying battle, but it was finite. It was won in a single horrific night. The battle for Providence, Ohio, was a fight for her own soul against the invisible, internal enemies of despair and isolation. That battle was not won in a night. It was a long, slow, grinding war of attrition, fought over years of quiet, uncelebrated endurance. We see Margaret a decade later. She is in the yard of a small house they now own, hanging laundry on the line. She is still in Ohio. She is a mother of 2 American-accented children who are chasing each other through a sprinkler. Her own accent has softened, the sharp edges rounded off by years of living in the Midwest, but it has not disappeared. It is a part of her, a testament to the journey she has taken. She has found a fragile peace, not by erasing who she was and completely assimilating, but by building a life on her own terms, weaving together the threads of her past and her present. The conclusion is sealed with a powerful, conclusive quote from the actual memoir of a GI bride. I finally understood that home was not a place you go back to, but something you build, piece by painful piece, wherever you land. The great historical forces of war and migration are ultimately measured not on maps or in treaties, but in the intimate landscape of individual human lives. The true cost of conflict is not just found in the rubble of cities, but in the silent, invisible battles fought by the survivors long after the rest of the world has declared peace.